What is the role of religion in our ever-changing world? From the News Channel 5 network, this is Issues of Faith.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to Issues of Faith. We are talking about the Hispanic community. It's booming in the United States. And we want to kind of get into its religious identity, how it is fluctuating, and what that means. Happy to have with us Yara González-Justiniano from Vanderbilt Divinity School, Assistant Professor of Religion, Psychology, and Culture. Thank you for coming on.
Thank you for having me.
And you've written a book that we'll get into. But I want to talk about this notion. The Latino community in the U.S., which is growing dramatically, is fluctuating in its religious identity. How is that true? I've thought Catholic, you know, that's the first thing you think of. But how is it fluctuating?
It's changing, I think, in terms of visibility, also in terms of generation, right? Like you have not just first generations of people who either have been here always, like the border crossed them, or folks who have migrated to the United States, have been here for several generations. So that changes the tradition around religion and their identity, not just their identity, religious identity, but also their ethnic identity, right? So you have all of these very complex world and family systems, and the historically understanding that there's a big Catholic population among the Latino communities. I, for example, was raised Catholic, and I now participate in the Disciples of Christ denomination. So having those kind of two worlds fluxed within me also inform not only my theologies or understanding of God and religion, but also my cultural links to family and to place. So having that, like, historically, because of the history of Spain and Latin America being part of the idea that they were bringing religion, salvation to people in Latin America, right? Along with colonization and other stuff. So
we'll talk. I want to talk about colonialization and decolonialization,
Yes.
which you talk about in your book. But your experience perhaps illustrates this really well. You said you were raised Catholic, and now you've switched. Is that kind of right? You're not Catholic. You're Disciples of Christ. Yeah. And so is that common? And kind of why did you come to that? And why are we seeing that happen?
It can be common. For me, it was a vocational response to what I believe was my calling to be a minister. Which is why I ended up going to seminary and then eventually getting my PhD in theology. So it was more practical, vocational than otherwise. But there is especially within the context of Latinos, Latinas, Latines, and in Latin America, there's a divide between Catholicism and Protestantism that might not have the same, or doesn't have the same, definitions or categories that they do in the U.S., like evangelicals versus evangelicals. They don't necessarily mean the same, though they have very similar tendencies in terms of practices and theologies and beliefs. But then you also have all of the Protestant missions from the U.S. that have established themselves in Latin America for many, many years, and then already having people migrating to the States with a Protestant identity, right? So
you're talking about Protestant missionaries. They go there and offer help.
Yes.
And so that's making inroads.
Yes. So they're very well established, depending on different denominations have different practices around mission in Latin America and the Caribbean, right? So people already are coming here with that sort of identity, not just a Catholic identity. And generational in terms of, depending on the, if it's a first, second, third generation or 1.5 generation in the US of migrants, but also age, right? And age group and all of these things determine the kind of affiliations that you see, especially around Christianity. And then you also have Latino Muslims. So you have this idea that Latinos, Latinas, Latines in the United States are coming from a homogeneous understanding of religion, right? And it's more complex than that. That is not just Catholicism, but also indigenous traditions are embedded in a lot of the practices. So there's Latino religions and then also cultures, right? And then all these things can be weaved together, but they have a particularities around people's own identities wherever they hail from. And I think that depending on where people, assuming that they've migrated, where people land on, how do people move around the states, and who do they encounter, right? Like what kind of combinations of different ethnic identities or racial identities among Latinos shapes a lot in terms of the affiliation, either of denominations or ethnic affiliations, because you can have what looks like a very high church tradition with a very like a lot of Pentecostal charismatic tendencies. So you really wouldn't know the denomination, if it's a traditional denomination or a mainline denomination, by looking at it,
right?
Depending on how they shape the service. Many
churches here in the United States are worried about people leaving the church, and that we're becoming more secular. And so how is that impacting, how does that work in the Latino community, the Hispanic community? Are you seeing people leave the church? Are you seeing people move from Catholicism to something else? I mean, what about the secularization of society? How is that playing out?
I think that people are looking for community. And I think that what we've seen, especially around different, especially independent churches, or what would seem here evangelical churches, but when I say evangelical, the word evangelico or evangelica has a different connotation in Latin America, which just means to be Protestant, and that very much, or in many ways, is relating to a charismatic Pentecostal way of doing church and community, because it also has to do with, can go in terms of like the history of the church in Latin America, but just in terms of different ways in which people have been prepared, especially pastors, have been prepared to do ministry, or not. Right, or not prepared to do ministry in the ways that we know, like attending a seminary, formally attending a seminary, right? And that shapes a lot of the culture. For example, when I say this, I think specifically in the 1930s in Puerto Rico, there was an awakening, and this awakening happened in the aftermath of two very strong hurricanes, where the Anglo missionaries left the island, and the people who remained were folks that were being trained to become local pastors, right? And then like that shaped a lot of the theologies and the ways that church was done, with a physical rupture or of whatever denomination was the one that was having those missions, right? Like because at least in Puerto Rico, the island was divided by missions.
Is it primarily Catholic?
No, not anymore.
But it used to be.
It used to be, yeah.
And so should the Catholic Church be concerned? Are you seeing them try to change this or do things? I mean, how is the Catholic Church reacting, in your opinion?
In my opinion, at least in what I've seen the church doing, I think that, and I've seen in my studies how there's, at least in terms of youth, there's not a lot of youth in mainline Protestant denominations and Protestant denominations and Catholic churches. But I still see, especially people who are culturally Catholic, for example, and ways that being or performing or having some sort of religious affiliation or identity transcends the actual church space, right? So it's hard to say, you know, in terms of numbers, it's hard to say that there's a decline in faith, but there might be a decline in attendance of a Sunday service or a Sunday mass. And one of the complexities around maybe understanding or looking into this fluctuation is that both these worlds are very independent. So, ¿cómo se dice? Yes, se me olvida la palabra.
Because Spanish, that's your
yes, it is my first language. Yes.
So
ecumenical work is very difficult, right?
Right.
Ecumenical work is very difficult. So I think that in the sense of kind of marking territories, and that's not just endemic to maybe Latino culture, but just in terms of the shifting waves of religion and Christianity, particularly in the United States.
Right. All right, we're going to go to break. And then you've done some fascinating work where you've been to Puerto Rico after Hurricane Maria, and you've studied how religion helps people in the midst of real struggle. And so that's what we're going to get on when we come back. You know, how are you seeing that in the midst of real struggle? So we'll take a break. Be back right after this.